Yeah. Okay, Goran. Yeah. Oh, that's one person's stuff away.
Okay, then I should start. So, good afternoon, everyone here in our office, and also for the colleagues who are online. My name is Goran Buldioski. I'm the Director of Programs of Open Society Europe and Central Asia, based here in Berlin. We really have the privilege to first welcome you all, the participants, as well the colleagues that will share on this panel, this conversation, in our Berlin office. This is an office that is second biggest in the Open Society Foundation's network, right after New York. We have more than 150 colleagues here. Not all of those work on Europe and Central Asia, where me and my colleagues work, but actually quite a lot of colleagues are covering global issues from here in Berlin, and others also provide support services across the globe for our foundation. I really would like to welcome. This is a topic of collaboration with DeZIM. We're really happy to co-host these issues. While on the issue of culture, in a narrow sense, OSF has been much more active in the 90s and the 2000s rather than in the last, I would say, decade. Still, for us, this is not only a topic, but this is very closely related with a lot of work that we do in the domain of human rights, and as well in the domain of promotion of open society and democracy. And with that, I really hope we'll have an interesting conversation on this gray Friday afternoon in Berlin, perfect for conversing rather than walking around.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Goran. Welcome everyone to our fourth event in the dialogue series, External Cultural and Education Policy Under Pressure. The event series is organized and designed by the DeZIM. This is the German Center for Integration and Migration Research in cooperation with the Goethe-Institut. We have someone from the Goethe-Institut here with us today, and Open Society Foundation. So thank you, Goran, thank you to Open Society Foundations for hosting us, and to the Cultural Department of the Goethe-Institut for the cooperation. The dialogue series, just say some introductory remarks. The dialogue series is part of a research project that we have at the DeZIM right now, where we are looking at funding and cooperation schemes of the Federal Foreign Office for Culture, External Cultural and Education Policy. And in this research study, we work with mixed methods to explore different attitudes towards diversity, discrimination in funding practices, but also in general in the Federal Foreign Office and the institutions that are funded by it. The study and also the dialogue series are funded by the Federal Foreign Office. Thank you for...
It's not my money.
And the dialogue series is an attempt to go out of the strictly academic or even policy applied research and be in dialogue about topics that go out of the scope of our study but are crucial to understand the policy field that we work in. And in every discussion we have, like, it's about a timely topic, and we bring together cultural practitioners, researchers, someone from policy, and civil society actors. So far in the event series, we have covered topics such as shrinking spaces and the support of arts and culture in exile, the definition and measurement for diversity and feminism in cultural policy, what is feminist foreign policy, things like that. Today's discussion takes us on a journey to explore the connection and differences between strategic communication and cultural discourse in light of disinformation campaigns. Cultural spaces in general, and especially international cultural spaces, are interested in fostering dialogue, supporting the plurality of perspectives, exploring shared meaning. Digital spaces are spaces where communication and dialogue can happen, connection can happen, but also they are spaces where polarization, distortion of this truth can be especially volatile. Access to reliable information is, as we all know, vital for democracy to function. And we've seen the dangers of the truth getting distorted in many recent cases, but perhaps most evidently during the pandemic. With our guests today, who are specialized either in supporting civil society organizations and cultural work or directly fighting disinformation campaigns, we want to understand what is already being done in this area and the tensions erupting in the cultural sphere through disinformation campaigns. So thank you to the panelists for joining us. And before I introduce them, I'll just say some logistical remarks. The discussion is recorded. It will take less than 2 hours, about an hour and a half, and then there are beverages and snacks that we can continue our discussions informally. The bathrooms are downstairs. I'm also supposed to tell you. Yeah. Okay, now to the panelists. With us remotely is Martina Buldioski, head of the East Starcom Task Force at the European External Action Service. She's strategic communications and disinformation expert and holds a PhD in political science. The task force that she heads runs the EU versus Disinfo project. That's the European Union's flagship initiative that monitors, responds to, and raises public awareness about pro-Kremlin disinformation. Martina is also engaged in EU strategic communication in the Eastern neighborhood. Also remotely is Nico Sandfuchs. Welcome, Martina, for being with us. Also remotely is Nico Sandfuchs. He has worked for the Goethe-Institut in various roles since 2009, with stays in Ankara, Munich, and Jakarta. He has a background in information science, political science, and Turkish studies. From 2017 to 2022, he coordinated the Goethe-Institut's digital communication and information efforts in the Southeast Asia area, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And since September of this year, he has been in charge of the Goethe-Institut's Internet department at its headquarters in Munich. Welcome, Nico. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and hello, everyone.
And to my right is Dr. Peter Kettner. He has been head of the Strategy and Planning Department for External Cultural and Education Policy at the Federal Foreign Office since 2020. He was head of the former President Christian Wulff's office from 2016 to 2020 and has served before that as a diplomat in Almaty and Ankara. He studied law and got his doctorate in criminal procedural law. Thank you for joining us. Last but not least, our host for today, Goran Buldioski, is director of the program Europe Central Asia at the Open Society Foundations. He focuses on issues related to democratic transition in Eastern Europe, the development of policy research on social and political affairs, and the role of civil society. Before joining OSF, he worked for the Council of Europe, the Macedonian Center for International Cooperation, and the National Youth Council of Macedonia. Thank you, Goran, for joining us. Okay, so just get us started, Martina. You work on the EU level in countering disinformation campaign, and you also are an expert when it comes to strategic communication. So could you tell us what strategic communication means from your perspective? What can we understand under that label? And what the EEAS is doing in this regard in terms of its effort in supporting civil society to counter disinformation campaigns?
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. When we speak about strategic communications in my team, we have a very hands-on approach. So instead of like a fully fledged definition, I would rather present you with a few of the examples of our work. So our work is very much based on countering disinformation, but in order to counter disinformation, we don't only have to react to it directly, which we also do. I will elaborate a little bit more on that later. But it's equally important to make sure that there is space for facts, for factual information. so that the audiences can make informed decisions. So maybe I will take a few steps back in history, but I will be brief on that, I promise. So the team started, the East Stratcom Task Force started its work in 2015. And that was the time when, well, some of us knew things about disinformation, about how it works, but if we compare it to the level of awareness that we have right now, we were in a completely different place. So back in 2015, the European Council decided that East Stratcom Task Force is to be established and to respond to procurement disinformation campaigns. And it was just a few colleagues that started this work, and they came up with 3 pillars of the work. And I think it's very telling that in spite of many things that happened in between, also in the policy area, and in terms of how much awareness was raised, we still are very faithful to those 3 pillars. And I think they stood the test of time, so to speak. And those 3 pillars are, first of all, so-called proactive communications, which means, yes, well, if we take into account that disinformation leaves a huge void, then it's our job to fill this void with credible information. So that's one thing that we still do, that we have been doing for the last 7 years. And our main area of focus in this regard is the Eastern neighborhood, which is Eastern Partnership countries and Russia, and also to some extent Central Asia. But there, our capacity is limited for now, but we do try to be there as much as we can. The second pillar is support for independent media. And this is also crucial. I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room that strong independent media are the very pillar of informed societies. So this is what we are trying to do as well in the Eastern neighborhood, in Russia, as much as this is possible, or towards Russian journalists, let me put it this way. And then the third pillar is direct reaction to disinformation. And this is, I think, the most visible part of our work. If you know the EU versus Disinfo project, this is exactly that. And so direct reaction to Russia's disinformation campaigns. And this is functioning on 2 levels, so to speak. So on the one hand, we react to single lies and manipulations. We keep track of them. We provide a track record on the EU versus Disinfo website. You can see a section called database, and this is a collection of disinformation cases that we have been tracking for the last 7 years. So you can actually see the patterns and particular examples of disinformation as was conducted for the last 7 years. But also we run raising awareness campaigns. So this is the second strand here, which are about explaining how disinformation works and what can we do on individual level to defend ourselves against it. On top of all that, we have the whole policy framework now being developed, but maybe there will be a separate part of the discussion when I can say a few words about that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Martina. Okay, so we've heard now from Martina on the EU level what's happening in this regard, in her work at least. And Peter, when it comes to the work of the Federal Foreign Office, the other governmental ministry that's represented today, strategic communication is a neighboring policy field to external cultural and education policy. And if you could tell us what the understanding of the Foreign Office is of strategic communication, perhaps also what's being done right now in this regard, if there are new efforts or reforms, and how does it meet with the other neighboring policy field, and where does it perhaps diverge? Where do you say those are completely different things?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I think that the strategic communication, well, communication should be strategic, otherwise we shouldn't communicate. But this kind of strategic communication is not only neighboring to culture and education, but to all, virtually every part of foreign policy. And that's the idea that we brought in since the beginning of that year, in a way newly, to say that we bring in with the department we work in, which is culture and communication, and education and science. So we take this as a platform, the whole department, for foreign policy issues. So we take all the means that we have, all the networks we have, as a platform in order to get into dialogue with other societies, with people living in any kind of society worldwide. So for us, the new idea and the new approach is to not only focus on strategic communication in the sense that we're countering disinformation, or we're talking about lines to take that we distribute to our representations worldwide, but also to say that no, we have to look at all the networks we work with, be it Goethe-Institut, be it the German Academic Exchange Service, or the German schools abroad, or the partners we work worldwide in civil societies, and take them as our partners in that strategic communication. In that sense, of course, we have to understand strategic communication not only in a sense where we say what we think, and everybody's going to distribute the very intelligent ideas of the Foreign Office. It's more an offer to get into dialogue. It's more something there where we start. It's a way to discuss. It's a way to think about certain things. It's an offer to get informed about the perspectives that we hold, and it's something that also means that we have to listen. So for us, strategic communication means also strategic listening, because we have to be aware of the fact that in this process we can get information that also changes our perspectives. At least, well, that should be the aim as well. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, this sounds very much in close alignment with the discursive approach, which is perhaps different than having a certain narrative that you want to transport, outside. And I was wondering if there is tension between the idea that you're strategically communicating in terms of having a narrative that you're trying to, share, or the more open-ended dialogue format that is perhaps more prevalent in culture.
I think, the problems that we're faced with is that disinformation campaigns comes from societies where it is quite easy to make propaganda approaches in strategic communication, and that doesn't work in Germany, and I suppose in other open societies as well, because we have a number of players we work with, and we have a number of views that are being held in the opinion-making process, and we have to take them into account. So I think there is not only one truth, and we all always should be able to reflect that fact as well. I mean, we, of course, when the ministry or the minister in that case has an opinion on a certain issue, and that is our political perspective or political view on certain things, well, that's a decision, and we have to work with that. But the decision-making process and the should also reflect that there are other possible views, and it's. I mean, we had that discussion, well, at a very low level when the war in Ukraine started, and when there were voices raised that said basically we have to encounter Russian propaganda by propaganda. And I think we're not able to counter that propaganda with propaganda, because they have means that we will never be able to use, which is good. Mm-hmm. So we have to use our means, which is offering people the possibility to inform themselves, making them ready to form an opinion, and that also includes, and that's something that on the long run, or maybe even before the long run, that what we're talking about in Germany, in German schools, that media education is a really important part of our well, school education. Of course, that goes for German schools abroad as well, but also for Goethe-Instituts. That could be an interesting factor on the long run, to say that maybe in 10 years' time or so, media education is for us is as vital as German language training.
Okay. Yeah. So I got it that you, if I understood you right, want to say that the work in the cultural department in fostering the plurality of perspectives is actually a preventive method that can be very important in not allowing disinformation to become as vital.
I think it's the only way we can proceed, because we don't have the means of propaganda, and that's good.
Yeah, that's definitely good. Okay, so we've heard from the two governmental organizations. Let's move on to the governmentally funded but independent institution represented here, the Goethe-Institut. Nico, as head of the internet department of one of the main cultural German institutions, perhaps one of the most powerful ones in the world, how do you use digital spaces in your programming? And is the Goethe-Institut active at all in the area of countering disinformation? If yes, how so? If you could tell us something about this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Caroline, and thanks again for inviting me and for having a chance to be here today. Yeah, how do we use digital spaces, and do we work in the field of countering disinformation? I mean, of course, not only through the pandemics, but especially like heated up through the pandemic, the use of digital spaces has become a very important topic for the Goethe-Institut as well. Before the pandemic, it was yeah, a nice to have add-on whenever we did something, whenever we did a cultural program, whenever we did language teaching, whenever we had a authors reading or whatever. It was yeah, we experimented with it, but it was nothing that we used strategically or that we used like with a huge concept behind it. And that has changed a lot throughout the pandemic. And during the pandemic, we as Goethe-Institut, we were forced to switch not only our language courses, but also our cultural programming, our information work stronger into the digital sphere. And we have learned a lot in that, and we have also built up a lot of capacity in that, also in the strategic field of how to use the digital space also for cultural programming and for information work. For example, in order to gain reach also into areas where we are not present, there's a lot of new challenges, but also new opportunities in this. And I would like to connect to a lot of things that Peter Kettner has already said. I think for Germany, the approach towards strategic communication and in countering narratives and the approach is a multilateral one. There's not only one player, and there's not only like one kind of approach to it. And there's a lot of players in this approach, and I think it's this is what makes this approach very valuable too. And the role of the Goethe-Institut is that yeah, we do have a narrative too that we all share, and this narrative is that we share the values of a free, democratic, diverse, and sustainable society. And the role of the Goethe-Institut is that in our programming, in our communications, in the things that we do, we reflect these values, and we open up spaces for dialogue. And I think this is also, as Peter Kettner has already said too, is also an important part of this countering disinformation and of countering narratives, because we do not counter narratives and propaganda through propaganda, but through opening spaces and through enabling dialogue. And also in the field of countering disinformation, Goethe-Institut has been quite active in the past years already. especially also in the field of media literacy, in the field of building up capacity building in the field of media literacies. There's quite a number of programs that we have in Russia, for example. There's a program still running right now, which is called "The Earth is Flat: How to Read Media," which is a really excellent broad program that aims at providing information on how to read information, to enable citizens to build up capacities in order to recognize propaganda or fake news, and it's doing this through a platform that has a lot of teaching materials on there, and that's is providing a lot of information on how to read information. And we're doing similar programs also in Middle Europe. There's a program that has been running for quite a number of years, which is called Klartexte. We're doing it in other regions of this world as well. Building up media literacy and building up capacities on how to read news and how to understand false media as also programs that we have been running in our libraries. It has been part of our library work in a number of countries for quite a while. There's a program called Fake Hunters, which we are running in Egypt and the Near East, which is running in East Asia in the libraries of Goethe-Institut, which is a program you can already tell from the name, Fake Hunters. It has a gaming approach, and it's teaching younger target groups on how to detect fake news and how to build up capacities on sort of like recognizing disguised false information. At the same time, we are also working a lot with multipliers on this. We have a huge network, as most of you probably know, through the Partner School Network, which comprises more than 2,000 schools around the world with more than 600,000 students. And so you see, we have quite a huge target group, right, which is the right target group for this sort of capacity building. And also through this teacher network that we have, we are trying to set up programs that are teaching teachers on how to teach on how to recognize fake news. So yeah, there are quite a number of approaches already that go into the field of capacity building. Alongside that, we also hold a lot of conferences on this topic, around this topic, and we connect civil society organizations around the world that are working on the topic of misinformation, fake news, etc. This is actually one of the strengths that we as Goethe can throw in, because we are not only in one country, right? We are in most countries of this world, and we are active in the cultural and information field in most of these countries. And so we have connections into the civil society scenes of all these countries. And what we do a lot on a regional level, but also on a trans-regional level, is that we connect civil society organizations through conferences, through programs that are working in these fields and that are active in these fields. And this is actually something that we often see is quite valuable, because these organizations otherwise do not have much. They do have chances, but they're usually working more on a national or regional level, and we can also help them to connect and to exchange ideas and to build bridges throughout regions and across regions. And the third pillar that we're working on is actually editorial content. We have, it's not one of our main cores, but we do have several editorial formats, several magazines, regional magazines like Ruya, like the Humboldt magazine in South America, the Jadoo magazine in Middle East Europe, that are magazines that also in their content reflect the topic of open dialogue, of diversity, of democracy, of free exchange of ideas through their content, and that are also sort of strengthening open dialogue in times where, and in countries where, this sort of openness is not always possible anymore.
Thank you, Nico. We'll probably explore more some of these principles you just mentioned now. But before that, Goran, as someone who works in a private foundation, perhaps you have more scope of action. Your organization is maybe viewed as more credible when it comes to information. Could you tell us something about how you are active in this area and the activities that you have running at the moment?
First, Open Society Foundations is active both globally, at the global level, because it's also an issue of not only disinformation, but the entire digital space that connects us all. And actually, we cannot resolve it without these connections across the world. And then second, each region actually has a pretty robust work. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we started this work in Eastern Europe, very similar as the colleague from Stratcom said. Like in Eastern Europe, this has been a commonplace, not only around Russia and Ukraine, but as well in the eastern flank of the European Union. Think about Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria. Still, as we're speaking, there's a very vibrant scene and demand also for, let's call it fake news, and I'll come to that. But also, we've been working quite a lot in Western Europe in two ways. One is looking more at the mapping, and as well probably finding sometimes even the inconvenient truths, where the Western democracies have been acting as enablers rather than disablers of these networks. The example here is we've partnered for many years with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue that has mapped not only how disinformation is communicated, but also what networks and how both technologically but as well politically has been made possible inside the European Union. And we're going much beyond just the visible part of that iceberg, which is the Russia Today or Sputnik and whatnot, when we talk about Russian influence. We also talk about domestic networks of disinformation that serve the needs of domestic elites, sometimes in conjunction with the foreign interests, sometimes independently. In addition to that, we have a very rich, I can speak a lot about Ukraine, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. We have a lot of national foundations. They work in a much more difficult environment. Actually, today, if I think of who can come and give us a good lesson about this successful work, is probably Ukrainians more than any person in Western Europe, because simply they've been at the forefront of that effort, in a way protecting their own space. Let's say coming close to here, in Germany in particular, we work with the foundation that I'm sure you all know pretty well, the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, that works quite a lot on digital regulation. There's a lot to say about that. And in places where COVID has opened really the floodgates of conspiratorial thinking. If we talk about Western Balkans, if we talk about parts of Eastern Europe, I could say there has been conspiratorial thinking before COVID. But opening COVID actually really opened this at a mass scale. I can emphasize our work with organizations such as Maldita and Civia in Spain, where actually they've been actively answering questions by citizens. Opening is in order to counter quite a lot of fake information that was able there. Let me just close, and probably is more as a subject to talk later. But our work is not only about the fact checkers, and our work is not only about the disinformation. We do quite a lot, as much as a private foundation can do, on the regulation. And regulation, a lot of our colleagues here also on this panel spoke about the free online speech, and in a way how you counter, how you organize it. But let's, in our foundation, there's probably the luxury of not being a taxpayer, not being directly at the taxpayers' money, is as well the second one, which is the pervasive business model of online platforms. Or even, to put it very bluntly and directly, one of the issues that we try to address is how to mitigate if we cannot actually limit the dangers that surveillance economy brought to us. Because in that, there is the root of the problem. It's not only about disinformation is one manifestation, but it could happen because the business model is conducive to it. I stop there. There's quite a lot to talk about that, but sometimes we really need to sort of look at the root problem. And here, I think the key issue is where the communication, where these debates happen, and how and what enables them, because it's actually easy to get into the labyrinth of discussing online speech, and it's easy to find a dead end if you approach from a human rights perspective, as we've done and we're still doing, into regulating just online speech. I think it's much more about regulating the business models that bring our democracies at risk. But I'll stop at that because I expect that with the colleagues we can speak more. And why I'm raising this, not because I expect the colleagues who belong to one sector to solve it, but actually one of the findings that we have from our work is that we need more and more colleagues from sectors that are really affected. And I would say the cultural sector, both offline and online, has been really affected. How many times the colleagues before me mentioned the word dialogue? While all of this info is killing any sort of dialogue. Actually, it's killing to some extent your business model. But we need, in a way, a lot of colleagues from the sector, such as yours, to join this work, because not only it affects, but only then we will stand a chance to actually, if not alter, at least improve some of the fundamentals. I stop there.
Thank you, Goran. Okay, this takes us right away to the question, where does disinformation happen? Martina, I know you think about this question a lot. What are the spaces where you fight disinformation campaigns, or even put credible information out there? As you have said, your 3 pillars. What kind of spaces do you think about using, perhaps, that you are not using right now? Yeah, if you could tell us something about this.
Thank you. I think before I go on to the spaces that we are using and those that we should be using, perhaps, but not always do, I think I need to make another point in order for you all to be on the same page with me in terms of how disinformation and information manipulation works. It was mentioned a little bit, but I want to piggyback a little bit just on what you said, Goran, about how Russian influence goes way, way beyond RT and Sputnik, and also beyond domestic debate. So we are talking about the whole ecosystem, the whole industry of disinformation and information manipulation. And we really need to understand that. This is not about several Russian outlets or several accounts on different social media. It's actually the whole ecosystem of politicians, social media accounts, troll factories, oligarchs, even the Russian Orthodox Church, diplomats, and I can go on and on and on. And we are talking about a global network of people and not real people that peddle the same disinformation narratives. So I like to think about it as throwing the mat at many walls tactics. So even if you are aware that one particular narrative is disinformation, when you keep hearing it, when you keep seeing it, when it comes at you from all possible angles, from different media, from different social media, also offline, then you are becoming vulnerable to it. And this is part of the tactics that Russia is using, but also this is not limited to Russia at all. Other actors are also following suit. So if we understand that this is the scope of the challenge, we also need to design the solutions to it, including the communication solutions that will go beyond what we are already used to. So we need to go beyond what is already comfortable for us, such as, Twitter, for example, or Facebook, or other Western social media mostly that we got so, comfortable with. What we are doing a lot these days, what we have been doing for a long time, but it got even more important ever since the 24th of February this year. We work a lot with civil society organizations in the countries that we try to reach audiences in. We work a lot with the media, but also with influencers, for example, and trying also to explore the channels that we were not exploring before. However, also from the experience, I can tell that there was this huge migration wave, so to speak, to Telegram this year for many reasons. Russian media went there more in a wave actually this year because they were banned from different Western media platforms, social media platforms, but they already started doing it before Russia attacked Ukraine again. But also, in order to reach especially Russian audience, there was this tendency this year to start treating Telegram, for example, as this kind of golden solution. And this is how we're going to reach the audiences in Russia, or Russian audiences in general. I think it's much more complicated than that. And it's not like even, being a fully fledged and quite known EU institution, it's not that easy even for us to just establish a Telegram account. Safety concerns aside, it really takes time and effort to build an audience. It takes trust from the audience. And even though, we like to think of ourselves as an institution that is worth the trust, right? It still doesn't mean that everybody will love us just because we set up an account on Telegram, for example. So from my experience, it's much more effective and much more important. And also it speaks to almost directly to the audiences that we are trying to reach if we are working with the organizations or with individuals that know the region or the country very well. Well, yes, I think I'll stop right there as far as the experience from this year is concerned. Yeah, okay, I'll stop right there for now.
Thank you, Martina. Okay, Nico, we've heard how important it is to build trust with an audience over a longer time. I mean, as a cultural institutions, you must also have to do with that a lot. What is your experience in building trust in digital spaces, and to which extent do you feel like digital spaces can become crucial in preservation of perhaps cultural works of artists who are not able to show their work in a certain place, or researchers who are not able to show their work in a certain space?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first, yeah, I would also like to emphasize again that I think this topic has a lot of different aspects to it, and all of these aspects need to be treated differently, right? And so Goran is totally right in saying that there's this whole aspect of surveillance economy, attention economy. I think this, especially the attention algorithms, play a big role in it too, because they're designed in a way that also opens gates for misinformation and for fake news and for facts that are exaggerated. And so the regulation plays a huge deal in it. Then there's also the aspect of fact checking and having to encounter false facts by, and there's a lot of initiatives on this around the world, on showing the false narratives behind false facts. And then on the other hand, there's also this aspect of providing safe spaces for those that are under pressure and that cannot show, as you said, their artwork anymore, or that cannot express their freedom, their opinion anymore freely, that have to leave their country. So there's also this aspect of providing safe physical and maybe even digital spaces, although I'm very careful in using this word, or those two words, safe and digital in the same sentence, because it might be debated whether there's anything like safe digital spaces. But there's certainly like also an aspect of like, how can we help those people that are under pressure and that cannot express their opinion or their artwork or whatever free anymore. And you were asking about how to build trustworthy relations in the digital space. I mean, I think first and for all, still for the Goethe-Institut, for us, and also regarding our role in this fight against misinformation and in the current world, is that the physical spaces are very, very important for us still. And I think this is also like one of our strengths, and it's important that we keep this also, because keeping those networks and being in the countries, knowing who needs help, and knowing who needs support, is very important, and we work a lot on that level, and we help a lot of organizations and a lot of artists and intellectuals under pressure in this way. But in the digital space sphere too, we see that our biggest reach is in those spaces, in those cities, in those mega cities where we're already physically present. So they're obviously, like, whenever we have worked a lot on enlarging our reach, our digital reach beyond the cities where we already are, and we are successful in this too. But we still see that despite all campaigns, despite all marketing, etc., it's still the places where we are physically present where we still have the biggest outreach. And so this is an interesting fact, actually. And for us, this shows that there's a connection between you as a trustworthy brand physically, and you as a digital brand that is perceived as a trustworthy brand digitally too. And on the other hand, I think what makes Goethe, and it's, if you know our website, you see that we have a lot of information offerings on our website too. A lot of those magazines that I've mentioned. We earn trustworthiness also because people know that we do not disseminate propaganda there, or that we do not disseminate false facts there, and that we always, in our editorial works, try to make very different opinions and aspects visible in our offerings. And so this is also what has earned us a reputation, and which is helping to provide or to build trust in online relationships with online audiences, because the people that follow us in our social media or that get into a digital dialogue with us know that those values and the messages that we send off digitally are actually messages that are at the core of our institution and the core of our work, and that they are legit messages and that they are authentic. And I think this plays a very important role. You as an institution and you and the messages that you send off have to be in match. And I think this is, on the other hand, if we look at some of the other cultural institutions, like also, I mean, you know, there's the Mir cultural institutes of Russia, or there's also Confucius institutes, etc. That's something that they are struggling with, yeah, because they are sending off messages, but there's also a lot of doubt regarding the authenticity of the messages that they're sending. And so this is something that we do not struggle with as an institution.
Thank you. And these cultural institutions, like be it the Chinese or the Russian one, sometimes they also play on resentments that are historically,
Exactly.
perhaps, legitimized, especially in the global south, connecting certain colonial experiences with, imperialism today, or ideas about imperialism today. But not only that, we've heard from Martina that when you get this information from all sides, what happens is that you might not be sure where the truth is. That's enough to be confused, not necessarily being convinced of a certain narrative, but just be confused, and that might be the goal sometimes. What also happens is that vulnerable groups get instrumentalized in these disinformation campaigns. And so LGBTQI is a very important enemy image, or the decrying of the moral decay of the West, signified by LGBTQI movements, or even refugees are often used in these disinformation narratives. And so my question to you, Peter, is how important is it to you to focus on these vulnerable groups then, and to support them. Do you see that also as connected to, fighting disinformation campaigns, but in a perhaps more indirect way?
Yeah, I think, enabling them, putting them in a position where they can connect with others, can prevent things like that from happening. I mean, if they're connected with other groups, maybe with the same groups in other countries, you can exchange best practices. You can build up networks where people help each other. That helps a lot. And yes, it sometimes also gives groups examples of how they can react to certain campaigns. And of course, as Nico already said, what is vital is that we still have these safe spaces in societies, and it's not only. I would definitely share the hesitance to talk about safe spaces in the digital sphere. So maybe it's about safer spaces, or even spaces that are that open that people can be identified. But when it comes to real life places, I think that is in a number of societies that is really important, and it's still important. When you look to, I think we talked about that when I was here for the last time, but when you look to what happened in Minsk, when you look to what happened in other countries where people are really under pressure, and people working in the cultural sphere are under pressure, it's the cultural institutes that have to go at first. It was Goethe-Institut that has to close down in Minsk, and that is I think that's a good sign that we have to do the utmost to keep them open, to keep these real places open. But at the same time, I think it's clear that the real life places we used to have 20, 30 years ago are completely different from the spaces we need now and maybe need in the future, especially in those societies where the digital, where the open spaces are under pressure, because we might need or maybe we don't need big rooms, big places where people can meet, or where a few hundred people can come to for a meeting with any kind of German, author or something like that. But we need more flexible presence in spaces in places like that. So it's also a question of how we adopt to situations in places worldwide, and I think there's no one size fits all solution. So we have to be more flexible.
So rethinking the space design, and also adjusting to the local,
and going away from that representative mode
of the goodies. Yeah.
Not only Goethe-Institut, it also goes for German representations abroad.
Okay, Goran, you heard no size fits all. You're also an organization with many offices in other places. How decentralized or aligned are you when it comes to, aligning your work around certain narratives, strategic ideas? I know you think a lot about theory of change. How much is your theory of change aligned?
First of all, just to say what colleagues mentioned, a lot is also about the local context. Today it's very easy to be captured that, it's a canon, conspiratorial thinking is global. Yes, there are some, like QAnon in Europe got some traction among certain population. But actually, if you look at what's happened with the disinfo space, most of it happens on local issues, and most of it actually ties in insecurities or doubts that already exist. And I think our work is exactly like that. It's very much centralized on looking at what happens in the specific context, language. Don't forget, culture is there, but also political system. We often, assume, or we will like to take what is the aspired political system, the one of democracy and open society, but in most of places where we work, that's still on the wishful thinking list. At best, it's struggling. And I think that's really important, because we operate in spaces which most of the time are not democratic, or they're fighting to be democratic. Now, in that, on that, I would like to go first with this space. You were talking about new spaces. Actually, we talked about old spaces, but these are rather the spaces where people are. Because we got used to, and I have to say also we as a foundation have to relearn, you know, you're here now in this nice room, nice office, and we expect you to come here. But actually, what radical right is doing really, really well, what all these people who do disinformation online are good at is also offline, because they go to spaces where people are. And that actually needs a paradigm shift. If I was here among my colleagues, I would have said places where flat white or soya cappuccino are not served. And this is where we need to be. The second issue is, you know, we are very much tied into a sovereign, I call it a sovereignist paradigm. Oh, communication in a different faraway lens is something that this government should do and I should not interfere. You know what? If this was a business sector, they would have interfered if it's against their interest. I think we have to learn that. We have to learn in many ways also what others are doing. I just used the example of, you know, radical right. My colleagues in the US will tell you that offline events of how radical right is also most of the Republican Party do, is 3-1 compared to the progressives. Much more of an engagement. Real people where people are. So to some extent, actually, the offline has to follow online. We have to challenge, when I say sovereignist paradigms, sometimes we have to say, look, we have to have a direct communication. And I feel the pain. We are in a foundation that really, you know, Karl Popper, open society, nobody holds the truth. Correct. But when you have to have a message, you have to have one, not the 50 shades of gray. When the Ukrainian president said, I don't need an airlift, I need ammunition to fight, everybody understood what he says. I'm sure there could have been 50 different messages to say pretty much the same or nuanced way, but there was no need, we needed one. And to be honest, at this point in time, where we are really fighting a lot of negative forces, I think as well the times allow us to be a bit more straightforward. Because actually what happens, we spend much of the time in fine-tuning our 50 shades of gray, instead of saying, okay, let's go outside and fight for this one thought, which actually a lot of people, progressives, will share. Second, we have to shred off, neoliberal paradigm. Martina spoke, just briefly touched upon the ecosphere. Media, she mentioned. We all will peddle the story of independent media. Great. And then you guess what we will say? Oh, but this independent media has to sustain the test of the market. They should not only give the right news, they should also make money. It's impossible. Most of the time, it's impossible. While actually, if you are, or not if you were, an oligarch or a billionaire in Eastern Europe, you will have your own media network, because to secure your business interests, this was a worthy cost. And I'm not saying that we should do the same, don't get me wrong. But if the world is like that, we have to change our paradigm, and we have to think, so actually we have to pay for that media, not expecting the independent media to be profitable. And last but not least, as much as it pains me, I like the authentic message. Actually, I think to some extent, Goethe-Institut, a lot of German institutions are really, they're punching in boxing terms, because it's times of war and whatever thing. It's funny that I'm using this, but they're punching below their weight. They have a lot of social capital. They also, don't forget, Germany has a lot of strings from the previous times, colonial and whatnot, even from current times with the business. But there is a lot of good and a lot of trust that actually is not used. Now, why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because especially where societies are polarized, we have to go also beyond the dialogue paradigm. Actually, I think one of the issues that we have to look at is, and we're really painfully exploring this, I can tell you a specific country in Moldova, we are never going to hire troll farms, whatever. This is beyond our, whatever ethical is in our work. But there is a very key question, which is, does one need to stop the poison, the disinformation that goes through the troll farms of Russians and alike? And I have to say here, our free speech and ethical dilemmas really have to be discussed clearly. But I think we also have to ask ourselves the question whether stopping the poison from flowing or disinformation is also merited in the times like this, where we are really facing a war. And I would say a bit more courageous. Now, don't get me wrong, our foundation tries to support pilots and whatnot. This is eventually key questions for governments. But through all this, I just want to mention that a lot of this practical work is also bringing us to challenging some of the fundamental premises on which we have this work. And I think at this in this particular moment, governments such as the German one and the cultural institutions, interestingly enough, are at the forefront. This is no longer the soft stuff. And to some extent it's good, because actually then we can, in a way, have this conversation, which is in a territory where we feel comfortable. When I say comfortable, Goethe-Institut has been doing this for a long time. German government, along the French, others have been in that space. They've created social capital. This is equally their territory as the territory with us. I stop there.
Thank you. No, I mean, if I get you right, it's a plea for less perhaps cautious messaging, perhaps more courageous one, and building on the social capital that these institutions have already acquired. Did you want to comment on this, or should I? It felt like you were nodding.
No, I mean, you're definitely right. At the same time, I mean, we have to adapt to new situations, and I mean, especially the foreign ministry, it's something like over decades we have been telling ambassadors not to talk to media too openly, and to be cautious, and now that changes. And instead we're telling them, okay, this is the messaging we want you to do, but they have to learn it, and they have to adopt to that new attitude. And in the past, ambassadors might have been chosen in order to represent Germany smoothly and whatever, and so we have to look for a different kind of ambassadors. Ambassadors that we're sending abroad. So it's more about, it's not only about representing Germany towards the, I don't know, whatever government, but it's also to go public and to tell about and to go to what Ambassador Melnick did here in Germany, very courageously, I would say, to influence the domestic policy debates. And to go there and to instigate discussions about certain issues. And that is something that we expect German ambassadors or German representatives abroad to do, but that is quite new. So they have to adopt to it, because it used to be the case that whenever they went public and there was something negative or a negative reaction to it, somebody from Berlin said, you must not do that because we don't want bad news. And that is also something that we have to adopt to a new culture, in the sense that if you go public and if you, be it on Twitter or Instagram or wherever, say things, and if you're part of domestic policy issues and discussions, that also means that that you can be criticized, and that there will be negative reactions. And you also make mistakes, and we have to learn that this is also part of the job descriptions of German diplomats, to make mistakes. Well,
can I react to that? I mean, let me go to my favorite country, which is Hungary. Not so far, and actually inside the European Union, country that I lived for a long time, and I didn't live on my choice. the American ambassador that was appointed in Hungary is an openly LGBTQI person who goes there with his family, with his partner, to hand in their credits and actually demonstrate how normal this is. Doing the same stuff as actually what, in the words of Viktor Orban, a normal, whatever, Christian family would do. Now, I don't expect Germany to do the same, and don't get me wrong, we can criticize Americans from this point onwards, but I think this is also some time of also who does get appointed. The second issue, again connected to my favorite country, is as well different modes of diplomacy. Actually, I think German government and Goethe-Institut and other players have to tap in an unexplored potential, which will bring a lot of inconvenient fruits, but they have to, which is the German business. German business spends much more money in Hungarian football, much more, under the table and above the table, than in culture. Well, actually, it has a stake. Now, don't get me wrong. I want German business to continue making profits in Hungary and elsewhere in European Union and whatnot. It's not German business to be kicked out. I personally even don't think that it should. It can be, but I think it's important that actually, when you talk about these things, when I talk about social and other capital that Germany has, actually the variety is much bigger. And interestingly enough, it still serves as an untapped potential. Sometimes it could be as symbolic. It doesn't even need to be about money. When was that? A year and a half ago, European Championship, football championship, the LGBTQI was a big issue. How good people, I suppose everybody here in this room, felt when we saw the Munich arena in the colors of the rainbow. And I felt proud, like many of my colleagues here, but I would have also felt prouder if the factory of Audi in Dior had the same colors, because that would have been even a double the stronger message. And why I'm saying this, it's not about the lights that you have to put next to the factory. Sometimes I think it's about the acknowledging your own power and actually using it creatively. And I do believe that this is something where, interestingly enough, I'm talking to people who deal with culture, but exactly because it's perceived as soft, which I do not perceive it. I find it extremely important in society, but I think that will speak to its advantage. And I think there's a lot of spaces, and I know that you are actually not only adapting, you're creating those spaces and those actions.
Thank you, Goran. I have one question to Martina. It's taking us back a bit to a former point that was made about regulation, but it's also about how can we test what works. So my first question about regulation is, how closely do you work with the divisions in the EU Commission or other agencies that are specialized in regulation? How much information do you share? And the other question is about what data do we need in order to know what works? And this can be also what works in the cultural sphere, or what works in digital spaces in terms of communication. And it's not only about persuasion, but it's also about what can actually help ease the polarization effects of such campaigns we were talking about.
Thank you. Well, as far as the first question is concerned, we are, I think, one of the most linked service when it comes to links between us and other parts of the European Commission and other institutions. So I can actually answer the first question very briefly. We share a lot of information, and we are very much the part of the regulation effort as far as strategic communication and disinformation and policy around it is concerned. And on that, before I actually move on to the second question, if you allow me, Caroline, I would like to respond to one of the points made in the discussion about whether we actually should at all stop or try to stop poison and disinformation, and what is the balance between this and free speech. and I think this is, one of the arguments, one of the debates that we are having ever since in March, the European Union decided to put sanctions on RT and Sputnik. And well, being part of the team that is responsible for this, I feel like, I need to take a stand here. I think we need to realize that we are way past the battle of narratives. It's not like, we have two equal partners in discussion here. We have, for example, the European Union, its member states, all our community of values, I dare to say. And on the other side is an actor, Russia, and also other state actors that are following the same logic. But we know the most about Russia, and it's the most aggressive actor on this front right now. The actor that uses every possible trick, every manipulation to to influence us and to create chaos, to further the polarization, to drive wedges, to build on the divisions that are already there in our societies. This is not a fair game. And the sanctions put on RT and Sputnik and a few other Russian outlets, actually. And also on top of that, we listed around 20 individuals that are responsible for spreading disinformation. This has a direct connection to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So this is not about those outlets saying something that we as the European Union don't like. It's not about having a different opinion, which is would be completely fine. And really, the European Union is still one of the most liberal spaces for debate, any kind of debate. Having said that, we need to realize that we are, in terms of when we are talking about RT, Sputnik, and other Russian outlets, we are talking about war propaganda and disinformation that was used to justify the aggression, and that is now used to justify war crimes. So it's really, when you look at EU versus Info database, that actually played a huge role in building up the evidence to put sanctions on RT and others. You can see specific examples from those outlets that actually encourage bloodshed, that encourage aggression, that justify it. So this is way, way beyond battle of narratives and just, conflicting opinions. And I think it's really important to say that here. And also, I very much agree with the need for us to go out there with one message and not that 50 shades of gray. And I think sometimes we don't do this enough. And building on that, I would also say that we should be much more vocal about our values, about what we stand for. This is really the time for courageous communication. There is nothing to be ashamed of here. And sometimes I think in the past we've been a little bit too delicate with that. I think the time is now to be courageous. As far as data and what works in the field of communication, I think this is the $1 million question in our field of work. It's very, very difficult to actually have precise data on impact of communication activities, let's call them that. Of course, you can always count the likes or the reactions, positive, negative, in the social media, for example, but that never gives you the full picture, given that the field that we operate in has a lot to do with human behavior and the way our brains function, basically. But one idea that we had as a team and that we are pursuing these days is we are trying to test different disinformation narratives in different audiences. We are asking about whether you believe this and that, for example. We use focus groups, we use all those methods and tools that are available for as far as the social research is concerned. But we also try to understand on a deeper level the values that are beneath the vulnerabilities that make us so prone to disinformation. Unfortunately, I don't have the results of this research yet. This is ongoing, and we are conducting it in 6 countries of the Eastern neighborhood of the European Union. I will very gladly share with you when I have the results. I'm really eager to see them myself. In any case, I think this is where we should go in order to understand better how our communication works. It's not only the very reactive part that we can see, for example, on the social media, but also the level of beliefs and convictions and values, which is obviously difficult to research, but we need to keep trying.
Thank you. Okay, so perhaps I'll open the discussion right now because you have to go earlier, and Martina also has to go earlier. And also it's open for remarks or experiences from your work, I think. It's good to just have, as Goran said, people from different sectors coming into this debate.
Yeah, thank you very much for this topic. So it's always very nice to see different aspects. For instance, the cultural aspect of music be something novel. I work at the GGAP and I am more responsible for platforms and also disinformation and influencers. And for me, what is missing here is we talk about offline, we talk about leverage and liability. What about platforms? Nobody has mentioned the role that platforms play as critical communication infrastructure. I mean, we're talking about us, we're talking about the others, what they can do, their fault, but the platforms are the vectors, you know, nothing is coming without them. So we see how effective each platform can be for signal multipliers or amplifiers. So what is the plan for platforms here from the government side or from over, like, do you have like, just, I mean, I have some ideas, but the thing is, what is the plan here, you know? Because we can talk all we want to about, it's very important to have this research, but what is the action plan? What is your plan? If you're asking, you know, to have courageous plans and ideas, I would just like to pick your brain.
Goran, what is your plan?
No, look, I mean, get 44 billion, 45 billion and buy Twitter back from Elon Musk. No, that will be a bad plan. Now, thanks, and by the way, glad DGAP is one of our partners here and also grantee, especially in the digital world, but not only. I have a whole list of talking points. I will try to go. You know, my colleagues and I really would like to talk a lot about sort of regulating disinformation and the regulating the space and the platforms. And I just scratched the surface with the entire business model of the platforms. We know that that's the root of the problem. But you know, to say to people in the ministry or in a cultural institution, and now you guys have to join. So when I do actually a plea, you know, usually that conversation is only among the experts on something which is pretty obscure technological debate, which you have to know. But all of us are suffering from the consequences of that space. And when I say we need people that work in this cultural domain, it's not for them suddenly overnight to become experts into the digital platforms, but actually to bring their voice and to say how their work is impossible or how their work is very, very difficult because of the way how platforms are organized. And when I talk about the neoliberal paradigms, you know, we sort of convince ourselves that, oh, the private sector can better regulate. I think on the digital platforms, we learned it in a very clear example, well documented, that self-regulation has its own limits, to put it mildly, or if to put it more bluntly, it does not work. I mean, if you look at the spending of these digital behemoths in their lobbying efforts, they come probably second or third to some other peer industries in this country of how much they lobby in order to keep their interest. But I think that if you have and you say, look, we in the field of culture, these are the 6, 7 or whatever, 3 points where actually we cannot do our work. You ask us to do this, but I'm doing it again on these platforms, which is impossible. That we need. And imagine if you have 6, 7 different areas joining it. Then actually you will not advocate from the position of what is right, but I need this to do my job that actually you, the very same government, has tasked me. Now I can go on with what could do with the platforms and the business model, with basically really limiting the polarizing content. I mean, you can do a lot of things, and technologically and technically this is possible. The holy grail here is to put this at the transparency. We at OSF, we are very proud to be one of the champions of transparency and accountability. Same for the platforms. The whole thing is that these algorithms has to go and be much more transparent, and the business model has to be exposed. Now, to be fair, the Digital Services Act and other things that the European Commission has put forward are probably among the most courageous acts and good acts that are out there. But as one of my colleagues who works on this area likes to say, the proof of the pudding is eating it. So we have to eat, or we have to see the Digital Services Act in reality implemented country by country, sector by sector. And my suggestion would be, cultural field, as we spoke, you mentioned how digital UN could be one of the, let's call it not only early birds, but to say, why don't we pilot this in our sectors? And I see governments and people in government who do not directly have a role here to play a more important role than just leaving this to the technicians. So this cross-pollination, at least not only in my mind, but in our programming works like that, to bring the people who will need a better platform in order to do their work, because then they will put the pressure. And that will be not only the Goethe-Instituts of this world, but also the people in the ministry that are not directly related to the DCA Act, but actually other areas of work that are affected or will be positively affected if the DCA Act is implemented.
Okay, so let's take this back to Nico. How much do you feel like this is an area where you could be more active, or are you active in the area of regulation, or as Goran is saying, to discuss and explore how the platform deregulation is affecting your work?
Well, put it this way, I mean, Goethe-Institut itself is not an activist organization, and so and it will not be able to become an activist organization and join the struggle like directly, right? But on the other hand, there is actually the platform question is a question that we are working on from different perspectives. One perspective is, of course, I think like one of the dilemma is that we all recognize the problem of the attention economy, the surveillance economy, etc. But we all, I think all of the organizations sitting here in this room, we are still using these platforms in our communication work, in the way we work. And so there's like, for us, like for you too, it's not a question whether we use them or not. We do have to use them. On the other hand, what we do a lot is we bring together organizations that work on this field. We organize conferences. We organize expert exchange between countries on this topic. And what we see, for example, is that there's a huge demand for the so-called global north and the so-called global south to talk and have an exchange on these issues. Just to give you one example, there's this famous Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz in Germany. I don't know whether anybody of you has a good English translation for this at hand right now, but I wouldn't. But I think most of you know what I'm talking about. This law that has been put into place in order to be able to take content, misinformation, radical content out of the net faster, has been put into place in Germany with a good intention. There's a lot of countries around the global south, or like around the world in general, that do copy this exact law into their own law, and not always out of the best intention. Singapore is one example. And what we do what we contribute to this question, for example, is that we try to bring together experts from those countries and from Germany or from Europe regarding the Digital Markets Act or the Datenschutzgrundverordnung, so that these laws are put into the different perspective, and not into perspective like, even in Europe and even in Germany, they have understood that we have to use non-democratic measures in order to control the internet. We take their laws, and so they use this in order to strengthen their own approaches, their own opinions, their own system. And we try to bring together experts, organize conferences on these topics in order to shed more different angles of and opinions on this. And this is how we approach also the question of the platform economy and other things. There's a number of projects around the globe that are working on this subject, often with especially this global north, global south perspective. AI, ethics and AI is another topic that's going into this direction. AI and artificial intelligence and is often regulated and also researched and put into place from a through northern companies and with a strong Europe-centric perspective. And we try to balance this out a little bit and bring together experts and opinions and also publics from the different spheres in order to debate this on a more global level.
So looking at it from the perspective of rights, digital rights, and perhaps also social justice perspective. Okay, are there more questions or remarks?
Yeah, I was Buldioski. We're currently researching Russian disinformation in Germany, how it's spread and how it's anti-Semitic. And through the research, I stumbled across the page of EU DeZIM-Info and the German government, also called the ministry. And it was a great page. There were notices written, Russia is spreading to Germany right now. But the problem is, no one knows about those pages. No one gets this information in public. Also, like, even though top politicians like Merz are spreading those narratives by comments. So I'm wondering, where's the issue? Where's the communication? Where's the stop of communication towards the citizens or towards the normal people? So maybe to question Martina can answer or Peter can answer, what do we have to do that everyone can get the information?
Martina or Peter?
No, it's just,
Yes.
I think if we knew the answer, I think we would try to solve the problem. I mean, obviously we all live in bubbles, and it's I mean, we were talking about the flat white and soya cappuccino bubbles that we live in, and it's hard to reach out to people in other bubbles. So I think this is one of the key questions of our time: how to get dialogue between bubbles, and that is something we also, I mean, within Germany, but also outside Germany, and that is something we talked about recently in our department as well. I mean, when we go to other countries and we do cultural work, I mean, in Hungary, for instance, we don't do cultural work with people who like Orban. We do cultural work with people who like ourselves. The same goes for Poland. And if we look to the US, we have Goethe-Institutes on the coasts, and we talk to people that whose mindset is pretty much the same as ours, and I think that's wrong, because we have to reach out to people who don't share our mindset, and that is something we have been trying for 2 decades now, since 9/11 in other contexts as well, and we were not too successful, to be honest. But that's something. I mean, that's something we're trying to do outside Germany, but we also have to do that inside Germany. And yeah, I don't have the key.
Do we maybe have to turn more activists? Like Nico just said, Goethe-Institut is not an activist organization, but do we have to be more courageous? Like ambassadors should be more there, more out there?
Well, there are enough activists. I think it's more about the coalitions. Because actually, it's exactly because these institutes are not considered activists, they will come with a different type of capital. But then, them joining a broader coalition will be the answer. I would push back. I would not say there was a failure. I would say it's insufficient. Because you also have to motivate a base of people who continue thinking progressives. But I think it's more actually about thinking, oh, but this is not not my domain. I'll stay in my domain. This is an issue that actually cuts across, and I think there should be a lot of sometimes even unlikely coalitions. So it's not to get this and say we're not going to change to be an activist organization. It's about actually where are we going to join efforts of others, and the other way around. Actually, where you will say all these technicians that talk about this online world will say, "Oh, Goethe-Institut and others, you have actually trouble with this. Can, how the better world in online will look for you?" Also, a bit of looking of how the good looks, because we always focus on how the bad is and how to prevent it, but sometimes we forget. And actually, there is quite a lot of experimentation out there. I mean, Martina was referring to some. How many of you would know now that the Moldovan government is experimenting of broadcasting some Russian channels, but when the news come, they ask for a Moldovan news to be put there, so there is no disinformation coming out. Do we know whether it's a successful or not successful strategy? The early indications are not that it's super successful, but at least they're experimenting. And there could be much more experimenting around that. Actually, experimenting happens. But I would say when you take a mainstream organization, or takes an experiment, then becomes actually trying to adopt it on a much larger scale. I think that's the cross-pollination. It's not about suddenly German. Actually, people like them, but they're not activists. That's also part of the way how they can exert influence. But where they join forces, it's a different thing. I mean, in so many contexts, if the German ambassadors just join the Scandinavian ones, it's already a message. They don't need to put a rainbow colored scarf and things like that. It's already a message. And they know it very well. And I think it's changing. Actually, it's changing for the better. But again, I would like to say, because because we do not work, I think we underestimated the potential of the cultural field to do that. We piloted, we brought Ukrainians in Africa. And we was like, okay, now you guys explain your story. So it was not the Americans, it was not the Germans, it was not, because let's not forget, between global and the South, there is also in between. Ukraine is in between, Moldova is in between, Western Balkans is in between. Actually, some areas of inside European Union are in between spaces. Maybe statistically they are a rich world, but they don't feel so. And I think that's important to do. And you know what? Surprisingly enough, people actually start, guess what? Not being convinced, but they start doubting the Russian narrative. And frankly, if we reach the people that before will not doubt, they will be so much convinced, that's probably a good goal to start with. I think we always, and let me look at our own foundation, we always want to educate the others. Martina said influencers. I'm a big fan of that, although that ethically poses a lot of questions to ask. But I'm a big fan because we want to educate, we want people to say, oh, you're right, I'm going to be now in your fun club. No, actually, I think even if some people who otherwise will not have a system of doubt start doubting, I think that's already a success. Because we're speaking with people who are not even used to doubt because so much of this false narrative has gotten into the head. So doubt to start with is already a good success.
Martina, did you want to comment on this?
Yes, gladly, thank you. I'm not sure if I understood the question fully because there was a little bit of feedback there, but I would hardly agree if that was the point, one of the points that you were making, that EU versus Zinfo is not a known project, that hardly anyone knows about it. And I actually have figures to back this up. The website itself was visited by 2.3 million people this year, only this year. And as far as social media are concerned, at least 5 million people reacted or at least saw the content that we are regularly putting in. That said, so I think this is, these numbers are actually quite impressive, especially when you look at other communication efforts by different EU institutions. That said, I'm not trying to be triumphant at all. And I think there is a lot to be done still. And what we are trying to do, and I think this is one of the key things to do also in the future, we are trying to speak local languages. We are trying to speak to other audiences. Our main language is English, and then the second language is Russian. but we keep getting feedback from different audiences, quite a lot from German audience as well, that we need to speak their language too. And actually, when we look at the audiences that view our content the most, they come from Ukraine, from Poland, from Germany, from Romania, and from the US, of all places. But these can be VPNs as well. So what I want to point out here really is that we have been working, especially in the last 2 years, to reach the audiences, especially in the Eastern Partnership region. So we translate some of our content into Georgian, for example, into Armenian, into Ukrainian. And this has, well, some levels of success. And we do try to work as much as we can, as I mentioned before, with those that know the local populations the most. So with different organizations, with the media. And I think this is the way to go if we want to really get our message across. As far as talking to the convinced is concerned, I think this is an issue to some extent. However, in my field of work, which is mostly about disinformation, this is not that simple. I mean, even if you know the basics of disinformation, it doesn't mean that you know every single thing about each and every tactics. So it's not like, I'm going to raise your awareness forever by one training, for example, or one article. We need to keep trying to reach also to those that already know a thing or two about this phenomenon, because it keeps evolving and we need to keep building our resilience. So it's not done just with one training or one piece of content or one communication campaign. What I also want to point out, and this will be my last point, we were talking a little bit about more courageous communication. I stand by that very much. But I think what we also need to remember when we do try to be more courageous is that we need to accept fallback. We need to accept criticism. And I think this is something that sometimes prevents us from being courageous and being out there more, because we are a little bit afraid of being criticized, whereas criticism is really the healthy part of the debate, and we should not fear away, especially when this is really about our values and everything that we stand for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to add a human rights perspective to the conversation, and I know you were addressing the topic of German businesses and the whole topic of regulation and cracking the neoliberalism. Yeah, so out of my perspective, now coming from the human rights and civil society sector, is that there is research going on. There are working groups, and there's more and more common knowledge about companies committing human rights violations, which is getting communicated. And I think it's there are many different levels, and I think that also implies the customer. And also we are called out there as an individual to have like a responsible consumer attitude, really, no? Because the whole discussion also has a global the climate perspective, no? So, and I think to really, like from my perspective, to get to a regulation on the global level, there's the discussion about guiding principles on human rights, and then to get a binding mechanism to be able to bring companies to court. And I think there needs to be more research on arbitrary tribunals. There is one standing tribunal, I think, and various spontaneous, I think 7 or 8 spontaneous tribunals who can actually judge companies, transnational companies, And I think, from my perspective, research on those would be helpful to see whether the interests are really balanced, and how can the the interests of the companies and the public interest be balanced. So.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we'll just stop here and then continue in an informal conversation. I think what this conversation has brought to light is just how many fields the topic of strategic communication and disinformation intersects with. I mean, human rights perspectives are important, the perspective from civil society organizations talking to those who are not already convinced of the narratives, how do you reach them in culture, grassroots organizations, regulation. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the panelists, also to the ones who will not be able to join us during coffee, but thank you so much for having dialed in, and thank you to you both and to OSF for hosting us.
Thank you.